Well, let's moving right along. We're just a few minutes, running just a few minutes behind schedule. That was a very interesting session on older workers. It was, so thanks very much for that. I'd like to introduce John McCarthy. John's, as you I'm sure aware, is Director of the International Centre for Career Development and Public Policy, currently located in Brussels and Belgium. And he was recently conferred with a doctorate in laws, honoris causa, by the National University of Ireland for his national and international contributions to guidance. And John will be chairing this meeting. So thanks, John. Over to you.
Well, just to continue with the last session, the table that I was sitting at, the all-male table, has offered to do a full Monty this evening. Okay. Beat that. Okay. Well, just a clarification about this particular session. The session will only focus on the evidence base. The issues of professional infrastructure and strategic leadership will be dealt with in the interest group under the heading of strategic leadership and coordination that's on the wall over there. I'd like to draw your attention to 3 papers in your folder which are relevant to this session and which you already, I'm sure, have read. First of all, there's the synthesis of country papers that has been undertaken by Dr. Mary McMahon. Secondly, there is Why Evaluate Guidance. It's a purple one which has been presented by Deirdre Hughes. And thirdly, there's a beige document, 2-page, entitled Who's in Charge by Brian Hebert from the University of Calgary. I'm going to begin by reading you a letter. I was asking people, do they have agony aunts in Australia? And somebody said, are you talking about an Aunt Abby? All right. Well, sometimes in the International Centre, I feel I'm like an Aunt Abby with the kind of letters that I get in. And here's the following letter that I received recently. Hello, John. So you can guess where this one came from. I had a quick glance at your newsletter received today, and like many other newsletters on career development, the issue of at what stage or age do you stop continual self-development? 5 years before retirement, 10 years before retirement, is not addressed. No research seems to focus on when to stop. There seems to be no focusing on the point where training development adds no more value to the person's employability. This is a neglected area of research because people involved in research are limited precisely because of that. They are not directly involved in saying at the end of the day, well, we got X number of people back in the workforce today, or we got Y number of people to be kept on instead of being forced to be retired, or other people who need to be retrained after being laid off, etc., etc. You might call that researcher deficit a lack of real presence. The research is often of the nice-to-know variety rather than how to translate research into practical, tangible, and immediate benefits. Who ultimately are the researchers' customers? Is it their paymasters or the people whose lives they want to influence and change? I would be interested to hear your comments on the above, and also if you can point me in the right direction towards articles about success stories and strategies in relation to ageism, such as recruiting prejudice, gatekeepers, and functional fixedness. So with a letter like that, you can guess I was kicking for touch for a reply. So I wrote as follows. Dear Dennis, I will shortly be attending an international symposium in Australia whose theme is the relationship between workforce development and career development. There, I will meet with people who can provide some of the answers to your questions. I will let you know what I've learned when I get back. Best wishes, John. Well, today we are lucky enough to have with us two researchers who can provide us with brief overviews of the state of research on workplace guidance issues, research that supports policy development. Our first speaker is Chris Magnusson. He's Associate Dean, Faculty of Education, Professor in Counselling Psychology and Head of the Counselling Psychology Programme in the University of Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. In 2006, he was the winner of the Stuart Conger Award for Leadership in Career Development, and he has spent 20 years of he's undertaken 20 years of private practice in organisational career development. Our second speaker and presenter is Deirdre Hughes. If you search for Deirdre on the internet, right, you will find her highlighted as a country and western singer. Now she assures me that the only similarity is the name, but never know, she could still beat the full Monty. Deirdre leads she's director of the Centre for Guidance Studies at the University of Derby. She leads a highly innovative applied research, teaching and learning unit designed to bridge the gap between policymakers, managers, practitioners, researchers and trainers. In recognition of her outstanding contribution to careers work, she was awarded a Leadership in Guidance Studies by her university, and she is currently working to completing her PhD on evidence-based policies and practices in career work. I will now let you in the hands of these very learned people. Thank you. Chris.
Thank you, John. I've got about 3 bits that I want to run through with you. Give you a bit of a background to what I think is important about the whole business of evidence-based practice and what we need to be thinking about when we're talking about evidence. And then I want to show you some very, very quick highlights of some evidence research we've been doing in Canada over the past year, and hopefully draw some parallels between the 2 sets of data that we've been finding. I think that the core question when we're talking about evidence is what should guide effective practice and how should policy be informed? And my answer to those questions are very, very simple. It's a standard theory and practice kind of an answer. I think we need to have a strong, robust conceptual framework, and at the same time, we need to have evidence that these concepts actually work. When we put those 2 together, though, we need to do so in a way that is both art and science. And most of you have seen textbooks on the art and science of counseling and the art and science of helping. I think one thing that happens to us in the career field is that we sometimes focus too much on the science and or the recipe for how to provide service, and we forget about the art to providing very good service. Let me give you a real quick personal example to highlight that. I was trained about the early stages of the ice ages in my counselor training program, and the career component of that was very much the structural or trait and factor or testamentellum approach that was referred to yesterday. My first job as a college counselor was working at a northern Alberta college and dealing with mostly people coming to college to gain their high school equivalency. So they'd left school, went out and joined the workforce, and now wanted to get some upgrading. And much to my dismay, I found that none of the techniques I had been taught worked terribly well with this group of people. Didn't work terribly well with the 40% of the client load that were First Nations or Aboriginal people. Didn't work terribly well with the women. And it didn't work terribly well with the blue-collar workers who were injured and coming back for assistance. So that pretty much covered the entire population that I was trying to serve. And my first clue that something was amiss was my own sense of frustration. And I think we need to pay attention to the emotional component of the work that we do. We need to pay attention in our own selves as evidence about the efficacy of the process we're engaged in, and we need to pay attention to the emotional component of our clients or our client groups as a signpost of what they're going through. So anyways, it was my frustration that led me to think that maybe my conceptual framework, the one I'd been provided with in my training, was insufficient. And that led to the development of a 5-process model that reflected several different aspects of how do you engage in career planning. Now, I think the problem with the original approaches that we had been provided with was that they were asking the wrong question. And the question seemed to be how to match an individual to a job. And when we expanded that into a whole series of other processes, we opened up a new set of questions. And if we ask the proper questions, I think we get better at finding the kinds of answers. Now, some of this you're going to see in the data that I'm about to show you in just a minute. The part of that, though, that I think is really important is that if our conceptual framework is robust enough, it should provide a way for us to change the client focus. So my conceptual framework started to work for this rather difficult population, but would it work for the opposite side of the educational spectrum, for the university students who didn't have those kinds of barriers and issues in their lives? And lo and behold, yep, it did. Would it work for groups? Would it work for? And then we can still fill in the blanks. So I think I perhaps take a slightly different perspective on the issue of such as how prepared can career practitioners be to offer services to a variety of populations. Can we offer services to the retired worker, to people in organizational settings, to the young person in school settings? And if our framework is robust enough, then I think the answer will be yes. So as we look at influencing policy then, if you're going to buy that practice should be guided by a strong and robust conceptual framework and evidence that the concepts work, our job, if we are going to influence policy, will be to help policymakers understand this broader context or framework that we're working from and then provide them with some evidence. So what I'd like to do is show you very quickly example of what happened when we tried to do that. We did a little survey last year, primarily involving representatives from agencies and practitioners from across Canada, and then supplemented with interviews of policymakers and employers. And you can see that our sample size in the last 2 bits was rather feeble. So most of the data I'm going to show you deals with those first 2 groups. And I just want to highlight a couple of what I think are interesting trends and issues here. First thing that we asked was, do you think it's important to actually measure outcomes? And lo and behold, 98% of the agencies and 99% of the practitioners said, yep, it's important to do that. So then we asked, well, do you do it? And that number slipped a bit. 84% of the agencies in our sample said, yeah, we actually report on the impact of our services. But here's where it starts to get a little bit interesting. We asked the question then, if you actually report on the outcomes of your services, what are the 3 most important outcomes that you report on? And far and away, heads above everything else, the number 1 answer was change in employment or educational status. So we placed X number of people in jobs is the most common way that services get measured. And marginally, you see a series of other items there. And I won't go through all of these. But they rarely get reported. Okay? The thing that gets reported is how many people get jobs, and in some cases, how many people develop educational plans or enroll in the next level of education. And this is the list that I find particularly interesting, because when you ask the question, well, what outcomes are you actually achieving that are either going unreported or that are going unmeasured? Now take a look at the list. And there's some pretty interesting things on that list, aren't there? Client empowerment is on there. Client increased self-esteem is on there. Client knowledge gains. All of the sorts of things that in counselor training we think are kind of important are the things that agencies and practitioners are saying they're achieving, but nobody's bothering to ask them about. Now that has generated quite a sense of frustration amongst the agency and practitioner community in Canada to be providing services, to be knowing that you're having impacts that nobody seems to care about. Nobody even is interested enough to ask about. So there's this huge frustration gap that's in there. So then we said, well, if you happen to be achieving certain outcomes, but either can't measure them or nobody is interested in them, what difficulties are you facing? And just want to highlight a couple of the answers they gave us. One, it's a very complex process. You know, we talk about in career service delivery, the lag effect. You have no idea when you plant a seed when it's going to germinate and take effect and what effect it'll have down the road, 2 months, 5 months, 10 years down the road. The fact that there doesn't seem to be, according to their perceptions, very much importance placed on evaluation and how hard it is to gain good feedback from client groups. And then some of the other issues were present for them. And what was becoming apparent was that the conceptual model that people had at their disposal to engage in the practice of evidence collection had some wobbles to it. It wasn't working really well for them. So overall, when we, and by the way, Lynn Bezanson will tell you where you can get the full report on this. It's on a website somewhere known only at the moment to Lynn, because I can't remember where it is, but she'll let you know where it is. When we supplemented the data from the practitioners and from the agencies with the views of policymakers and employers, we got amazing overlap. There was consensus and agreement that, yep, impact assessment is very important, that current evaluation practices are totally inadequate, that there are, and this is one that surprised, I think, some of the practitioners, that important outcomes are not measured and are not reported. In other words, the policymakers and the employers were agreeing that there's some important stuff that just doesn't get asked about, and we need to start asking those questions. Oops, I did the double. And the conclusion there, primarily from those in the trenches, is that because it's so complex and because there's so many different variables involved in effective career management and career planning and career transition, that what we need is a very sophisticated in scope, but a very simplistic in application evaluation procedures. We have to find a way to develop tools and processes that can be used right on the front lines, but then that still allow us to aggregate data across contexts and across situations so we can do some longitudinal work, for example. So these are some of the things that we need to be able to develop, better tools, but really importantly, a culture of evaluation. And I'm just throwing those up as some teasers, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about some of these issues in the discussion group that we have. But clearly, evaluation and impact assessment needs to be a priority in all sectors. Now, I just wanted to very quickly, I know I'm running out of time here, to give you a sense of that if we have some evidence that something is wrong and we need to develop a better conceptual framework, the next step for the Canadian Research Working Group is to start this business of a more robust conceptual framework that will help to guide evaluation. So, and here are the two pieces to it, that evidence-based practice and then outcome-focused interventions. So we asked the question, well, what will work? And that's a whole series of research and local clinical scientists. And then how will I know as a practitioner when things are working? And that has to do with the learning outcomes of the client and the impact that the client has on stakeholders. And so this is very quickly, and it's simplistic, but in unfolding it, you'll see that it can be a very rich idea. We tend in evaluation to focus only on that third dimension, the outcome dimension. What do we produce? The outcome is somebody got a job. But we need to pay attention as well to the process that was used in the intervention. It makes no sense to take an outdated and outmoded model of career services as your process of intervention, and then say, well, career development doesn't work because it doesn't produce the outcomes we need. So we need to be able to link the resources that agencies and individuals have at the beginning or the input stage, then the strategies and processes that they use, and use that to frame the kinds of outcomes. And outcomes can be learning outcomes, they can be personal attributes, they can be impact outcomes. Processes really are those activities that link the outputs or deliverables. And they can be very generic or they can be very specific. And what we're doing now is trying to unfold and unpack each of these. We've got about 20-some ways to unpack the outcomes dimension. And the goal will be to start to design impact studies that contribute to each of those cells, each of those pieces. And hopefully, the real dream is that if we can do that in a systematic way, it means we can do a project in lonely little Lethbridge, Alberta, and have it contribute in a significant way to our international understanding of the impact that career services have across contexts and across time. So there's the Reader's Digest condensed version.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Before I start the serious business of my presentation, I would like just to confirm that I am not a country and western singer, never have been, never will be, and don't have the talent and skill for that. So I will begin by focusing more really on my experience and knowledge really of this subject area of evidence base and professional structure. I have to say, first of all, that I want to duly acknowledge the expertise that is here in the room, and I feel very privileged in many ways to be sitting up front, having an opportunity to share my work. I know many people in the audience have very, very interesting work, particularly policymakers, researchers, trainers, and managers. So really what I'm going to do is just give you a little taster of my experiences, firmly located within a United Kingdom context. But what I'd like to do is to spend the next 8 minutes or so really just drawing on my experience as a practitioner, a trainer, a manager, a researcher. Really over the past 22 years, it's quite frightening when you have to move on from a session on older workers. I'm now slipping into that. I'm an older worker. But really just to say that the issues that I'm going to share with you are very much firmly rooted in my eclectic experience really in a number of roles. And I do feel I should begin by saying that one of the reasons when I look back at my own career as to why perhaps I'm doing the sort of job that I'm doing now is that really from the very early 1980s, I've had a curiosity about this business of people and jobs. And I've also had a curiosity and a really strong desire to understand better how individuals manage their life and their work experiences over time, and to begin to look and find what works for people and what doesn't. And when I was a student enrolled on my postgrad course, I was always the student that had questions to ask around, do you have to be qualified as a career guidance professional in order to be able to do careers work? And there's a whole host of questions that I think will surface later. But let me just begin by saying that I'm going to look at this issue of assessing and measuring the impact of careers work. I want to draw on some examples of current quality assurance approaches, because careers work, particularly if we look at career development and we look at workforce development, really what underpins a lot of that is whether or not the punter, the client, the consumer actually believes that they're getting a high quality, worthwhile service. And without that, then careers work is going to have its difficulties. So my research has actually looked at many of the quality assurance models and standards which actually look at what is high quality careers work. And I'm going to just give you a little flavour of that. Then what I'd like to do is just highlight a few of the key issues and examples of ways of sort of innovative approaches to addressing this issue of how do we tackle the practitioner's conceptual framework and influences, as well as the very practical settings in which they operate, alongside the workforce, the world of work, and people's careers therein. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that the search really for meaningful outcomes that demonstrate social and economic impact, the benefits for careers work, is indeed a worldwide phenomenon. Today, I think we're all witness to that in terms of what we have heard so far. We hardly need to dwell on the rationale for assessing, measuring, reporting on careers work. But a useful reminder is the bottom line is that we have to be able to report on our work to gain and retain funding, and to demonstrate very clearly which differing forms of provision can actually yield positive returns for various recipients thereof. Also, within that context, we are looking at figures, the quantifiable issues, as well as the qualitative achievements that are necessary to persuade others who perhaps have not invested as much time and energy in careers work as we have, to persuade them that it is a worthwhile and indeed for the private as well as the public good, a worthwhile activity. Previous speakers, Mary, Peter, others, have highlighted standards and training requirements that protect both the consumer's interests and make more explicit to various stakeholders codes of practice and entitlements that really frame careers work. What I'd like to do is just to begin by saying that we know that one of the difficulties that in some way bedevils the work of a careers specialist is that in terms of providing evidence on what works and what does not work, it's likely to vary at differing levels for differing people and for differing groups. Clients and customers are likely to be more concerned with having access to high quality services, i.e., was the service accessible and useful. Managers and practitioners are likely to be concerned with formative issues. Which elements of the service actually contributed most effectively to the outcomes achieved? And how can these elements be best managed to contribute towards continuous improvement? Policymakers, we've heard Chris talk about outcomes. Policymakers, by and large, are likely to be most interested with summative evaluation and cost-benefit outcomes. Did the service achieve the outcomes expected of it? And what are the cost implications for current and future services? And least not we forget, given our focus on workforce development, employers, those key agents who are most likely to be concerned with receiving appropriate referral of clients into their companies. Did the service that was provided, was it effective in terms of signposting or supplying the right sort of people, the right person for the job? And therein lies our challenge for evidence base in careers work. We have many masters to serve, and we have to find useful ways of doing so. This involves us having a very clear sense of what is to be assessed and indeed measured, and I use the word assessed and measured because we can't measure everything. Many of practitioners I speak to often say, if only we could measure it, then we could actually solve some of the difficulties around misconceptions around our work. I use the word assess and or measure because we have to look at different techniques in terms of how we can account. We also have to look at what systems and processes are in place for collecting and collating relevant data. And I'd like to build on, towards the end of my presentation, Chris's point about what management and quality assurance arrangements and systems are in place to actually ensure that the data is acted upon. There is a real danger that what we do is we talk evidence, evidence, evidence. We beaver away at gathering lots of evidence and no one listens. So I want to talk a little bit around how we actually tackle that. But what I would like to just briefly say is that there is no shortage of different models that exist and that have been applied to the planning and indeed management and delivery of career and workforce development. We often, as we've already heard, things are categorized in terms of inputs, processes and outcomes. Often outcomes very much on the immediate outcomes. Did the person get a job or go into learning and work? But it's quite interesting when you begin to look at quality standards in the UK and differing ways in which quality standards are actually assessed and measured, that you actually see that inputs and processes are actually typically defined in the form of service level standards, whilst the outcome factors are often defined in terms of performance indicators. So very briefly, for example, organisational service standards in career organisations are often focused on the minimum qualification levels of staff, the set procedures for dealing with telephone inquiries, for example. Was the inquiry answered within a certain number of calls? In contrast, the performance targets, certainly within the UK, we have a lot of evidence gathered around the percentage of user satisfaction rates. We also have evidence around the transition into programs of learning and work. But we actually, when we look at the literature that's available, both in terms of careers work, and I recently completed a literature review of career development interventions in the workplace, which is available on our website, and I'll give you the details later. But we actually see that there are a whole range of research and literature out there. But one of the strong beliefs that I have is that we're not using it smartly, and indeed we're not presenting it in a way that's both user-friendly for the practitioner, but equally user-friendly for the manager and the policy maker. Now, I don't have time really to go into all of this in detail, so I'm going to just flick through. But this slide just illustrates for you the differing models in the UK that actually are there that address issues to do with quality standards. But in the UK, what we have found is, as in many other countries I hear, but perhaps in the UK because of our Learn Direct initiative, that we actually are finding differing models emerge in career practice, particularly looking at the use of ICT websites and helplines. And recently, we have had a new initiative which is actually looking at guidance being delivered over the telephone, which is being piloted. Just very, very quickly, key issues. We've already heard terminology needs to be made more explicit in careers work, but also more consistent within and across organisations so that the data can be more generalisable and comparable. And I welcome the development of an international forum that will actually enable us to do that not just within our own settings and countries, but actually across country. There is a paucity of data around cost analysis and how this can be broken down. And one significant point, and I'm conscious of time, but I just want to very briefly make this point, that a major challenge, as I see it, is the extent to which the profession has gathered and analysed data to show that there are certain delivery strategies that for the majority of clients are more effective than others. Indeed, it could be that certain strategies may be only truly effective for certain individuals or groups. And if that's the case, we have to help the policymakers understand that better so that they can decide how best to deploy their resources. The other issues are around the systems of support and motivation that exist for evidence-based practice. We have to some extent heard about the practitioners and whether the practitioners are up to the challenge in terms of their motivation. I really do believe they are up to the challenge, but we have to find ways, not just of supporting them, but to policymakers who aren't here today, our absent friends. Do they have the systems of support and the motivation to actually use well the evidence base in this territory? Finally, what I'd like to do is just point to the availability of research data. We heard from Wendy earlier yesterday and in various parts of the session about the need really for the career profession to be more specific about how it will engage with employers. In the UK, we have a number of exciting initiatives around high-quality, industry-based labour market information that is gradually becoming more available through a National Guidance Research Forum website that focuses very much on labour market trends developed by our colleagues at Warwick University. Also, we have a 5-year longitudinal study in England that's being funded by the department that's giving us more insight into what is effective guidance, and linked to that, what do practitioners in terms of their cultural and their practical experiences, how is that bearing down upon that? Just moving on very quickly to my conclusion, John will be very delighted to hear. The work at the Centre for Guidance Studies, what we have sought to do as applied research unit based in a university is to actually adopt an interdisciplinary approach. And one of the key things that we have done is we have worked across academic disciplines, bringing together economists, bringing social scientists, psychologists, various specialists who actually are interested in this notion of career and work and career development. If you would like to find out more, then please do visit our site. But my final thought that I would like to just leave you with is that we mustn't get too overburdened with thinking that the problem actually perhaps sits with practitioners not being ready to meet the challenge. Our research evidence shows that practitioners are crying out for help, and their good work, a validation process in terms of what Chris has just said, their good work, they really want it to surface. And our job as researchers, policymakers, practitioners and trainers is to design systems of support that will actually make careers work be recognised as something that everyone needs and wants. Thank you.
Well, we've had 2 excellent presentations. If you look at the depth of and the scope of the work that's been undertaken both in Canada and in the United Kingdom, I'm sure there are countries here who would love to be involved in this kind of activity and love to learn from the experience of both Chris and his group and of Deirdre and her centre staff. And I think one of the things that we hope will come out of this symposium, and we have been discussing this separately and also with Raimo from the University of Jyväskylä, is to see given that these issues are issues for all countries, what we can do together in international collaboration, in which the International Centre can play a lead role in organising such comparative work. And I must say that that at least the seeds of this have been sown here, and maybe by the end of the interest group, we will even have a wider we might have wider support for undertaking this work together. Can I now say that you have 10 minutes to answer 2 questions which have been framed for you by Chris and Deirdre. They're not very difficult questions because they're at the end of the day. So you'll have 10 minutes. You may discover that that you have very little to offer in your group, or that you have an awful lot to offer in your group. But we look forward to getting some feedback from you in 10 minutes. So you have 10 minutes now to consider these 2 questions.
Okay, we're going to a couple of things I want to say. Firstly, this is a very important issue, so don't let it go. There is one of the interest groups. It is to do with the evidence base. For those of you who are going to a different interest group, both John or Deirdre or Chris are very happy to talk to you over drinks tonight or any other time, just to keep in touch and build that network. And they're quite happy to stay up till dawn to sort of run this issue with you. So don't feel like you're going to lose anything out of this time. I need to say a couple of things before we can do that later now, I suppose. Okay, so the interest groups are coordination and leadership in the C4th room. It's going to be chaired by Lynn. The C4th room is to the left of the lift, past the Secretariat. Culture sensitivity is in the Clontarf room, which is straight out the door right behind, which says exit just there, and across the way, and there you are at the Clontarf room, and that's on that one. Training and development in the Barton room. If you go out this door or out that door and to the left, and that's the evidence base, and it's a large enough room to take you. So training and development room, and for the evidence base you'll stay in the ballroom. So training and development's in the Barton room, to be led by Mary and Ramo. And the task is to provide a recommendation or some conclusions and recommendations from that discussion back to us. At 5:15. The other issue... So we are talking about policy in relation to training and development and in relation to organisation and strategic leadership. So you can move to those groups now. Thank you.